It was one of those nights, the kind where the road stretches endlessly into the black abyss, where time feels as though it has folded in on itself, and the hum of the truck engine is the only sound that keeps you tethered to reality. Jackson Kane had been a trucker for 15 years. He had seen his share of weird things: lonely figures standing at rest stops, unexplainable lights in the sky, but he was a man grounded in logic. Until that night. The assignment was simple: a long haul through a series of desolate highways, cutting through the heart of the Midwest. Jackson had been driving for hours, deep into the quiet rural lands, when a thick fog began to creep over the horizon, swallowing the moonlight in its embrace. There was something unnatural about the way the fog moved. It was dense, like a wall of cloud, but Jackson shrugged it off. Weird weather wasn't uncommon out here. The radio crackled, breaking the silence, but it was just static. He turned the dial, trying to catch a signal, but the channels were dead. "Great," he muttered under his breath. His truck lights illuminated only a few feet in front of him now, the rest lost to the heavy mist. About 10 miles later, Jackson saw something in the distance, a dim light. As he approached, he realized it was another truck, parked on the side of the road with its hazard lights blinking. Reluctantly, he pulled over. Truckers helped each other out. It was an unspoken rule. Stepping out of his cab, the cold, damp air hit him immediately. The fog wrapped around him like icy fingers. He walked toward the other truck, but something felt off. The air was still, too still. As he got closer, he noticed the driver's side door was slightly ajar, but no one was inside. He glanced around. "Hello?" His voice seemed to be swallowed by the mist. Jackson climbed up to take a better look inside the truck. The driver's seat was empty, but something about the interior was strange. There was no personal clutter, no logbook, no food wrappers, nothing. It was unnaturally clean, like it hadn't been driven at all. Suddenly, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The silence became oppressive. A sense of dread crawled up his spine. As he turned to get back to his own truck, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye, a figure standing a few yards away, barely visible through the fog. It was tall, with long limbs, and the fog seemed to swirl unnaturally around it. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, watching. "Hey, you need help?" Jackson called, though his voice cracked, betraying his nerves. No response. The figure didn't move. Jackson's instincts screamed at him to leave, to get in his truck and go, but he couldn't. Something about the figure's stillness, the way it blended with the mist, felt wrong. He took a step forward, then stopped. The figure moved, not toward him, just a twitch, a jolt, like it was adjusting itself. That was enough. Jackson turned and sprinted back to his truck, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He leaped into the cab, slammed the door shut, and locked it. His hands were shaking as he fumbled to start the engine. The truck roared to life, and he hit the gas. In his rearview mirror, the figure was gone. But as he sped away, the radio, which had been nothing but static, crackled back to life. At first, it was faint, garbled voices, almost like a conversation out of sync with reality. But then, a single voice broke through, deep and distorted. "You can't leave." The engine sputtered, the lights flickered, and Jackson's heart raced. He slammed his foot on the pedal harder, trying to push the truck faster, but the fog was growing thicker, almost solid, like a wall. And then, suddenly, his headlights illuminated something. Another truck. It was the same one, the same hazard lights blinking, the same driver's door slightly open. He had driven in a circle. Jackson's mind raced. He had been driving straight. There were no turns, no intersections. How had he ended up back here? He wasn't one to panic, but this was impossible. He rubbed his eyes, trying to make sense of it, but when he opened them, the figure was standing in front of the truck, right in the middle of the road. It was closer now, its features still obscured by the mist, but there was something undeniably human about it. Its head cocked to the side in an unnatural way, like it was studying him. Jackson threw the truck into reverse, tires screeching as they skidded on the wet pavement. He wasn't going to stick around and find out what this thing was. But as he backed up, his rearview mirror reflected something even worse. More figures, emerging from the fog, slowly, deliberately, surrounding him. His breath came in short, sharp gasps as he whipped the truck back into drive and swerved off the road, plowing through the fog, desperate to escape. The truck bounced over rough ground, headlights barely cutting through the dense mist. But the figures, more of them now, were everywhere, their shapes just beyond the edge of visibility, lurking in the periphery, always just out of reach. Jackson didn't know how long he drove. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed irrelevant. The fog clung to him, oppressive and thick, until finally he saw it. A light ahead. Not a truck's hazard lights, but something brighter, warmer. He steered toward it, praying it was a gas station, a rest stop, anything. As he got closer, the fog thinned and the light became clearer. It was a small diner, glowing in the darkness like a beacon. Jackson pulled into the lot and parked, his entire body trembling. He staggered out of the truck and stumbled toward the diner, desperate for human contact, for safety. The bell above the door jingled as he pushed inside. The warmth of the place hit him immediately, and for a brief moment he felt safe. There were people sitting at the counter, a waitress pouring coffee. Normalcy. Jackson took a deep breath and approached the counter, his voice shaky. I need help. There's something out there, on the road." The waitress looked up, her expression calm, almost too calm. "Take a seat, Han. We've all seen them." Jackson froze. "What?" She poured him a cup of coffee, sliding it across the counter. "You're lucky you made it here. Some don't." The other patrons glanced at him, their eyes tired and hollow. He felt the weight of their stares. He wasn't the first to escape the fog, and he might not be the last. But as he looked out the diner's window, his blood ran cold. The fog was outside, creeping closer, pressing against the glass like it was alive. And standing just beyond it, barely visible, was the figure, waiting. The stretch of highway known as Devil's Pass was a route most truckers avoided. It cut through a remote forested area in the Pacific Northwest, where the mountains loomed over the road like silent sentinels, and the trees stood so tall and thick they blotted out the sun even during the day. But tonight, Jake didn't have a choice. His deadline was tight, and taking the pass would shave hours off his trip. He'd heard the stories, of course. Every trucker had. People disappearing, strange sightings, even weirder noises. But Jake was a man of reason, and he chalked it up to tall tales and exaggeration. It was nearly midnight when he reached the start of Devil's Pass. The moon was a sickle in the sky, its dim light barely penetrating the thick canopy of trees. His headlights seemed swallowed by the darkness, illuminating only a narrow stretch of the two-lane road ahead. The air was still, unnervingly quiet, with not even the whisper of wind. He felt a strange sense of isolation as he drove deeper into the pass. The trees seemed to close in around him, and the road twisted and turned in unnatural ways, like it was trying to disorient him. The first sign that something was wrong came an hour into the drive. His CB radio crackled to life, spitting out static and garbled voices. At first, Jake thought it was just interference, but then he heard it. A voice, faint but distinct, speaking through the static. "Don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop." Jake grabbed the radio. "Hello? Who is this? You need help." The static hissed, then silence. He tried to shake it off. Old equipment, bad signal, nothing unusual. He drove on, gripping the wheel tighter, his eyes scanning the road for any sign of movement. The fog started to roll in, thick and heavy, clinging to the trees like a living thing. His visibility dropped to almost nothing, the road ahead a blur of swirling mist. And that's when he saw her, a woman, standing in the middle of the road. Jake slammed on the brakes, his truck screeching to a halt just inches from her. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her long dark hair hanging over her face, her clothes ragged and torn, soaked as if she'd been out in the rain for hours. But there was no rain. Not here. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at her through the windshield. He could see her chest rise and fall like she was breathing, but something about her posture, her stillness, was wrong. It was like she wasn't really there. He didn't want to open the door. Every instinct told him to drive, to get out of there. But he was a trucker, and if someone needed help, it was his job to do something. Reluctantly, he reached for the door handle. But before he could pull it, the woman lifted her head. Her face was pale, impossibly pale, her skin stretched tight over her bones like a corpse. But it was her eyes that made Jake's blood run cold. They were black, completely black. No whites, no pupils, just empty voids that seemed to stare through him. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, her jaw unhinged, wide and unnatural, as if she was silently screaming. Jake's instincts kicked in. He slammed the truck into reverse, Dula, tires spinning as they struggled to grip the wet road. He backed up, the woman standing there, unflinching, her gaping mouth still open. Without thinking, he shifted into drive and swerved around her, speeding down the road, his heart hammering in his chest. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror, she was gone. No sign of her on the road, just fog. Jake's hands shook as he gripped the wheel, trying to calm his nerves. What the hell had he just seen? His rational mind tried to explain it away. Maybe it was some lost hiker, a trick of the light, or exhaustion playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew better. He had seen her face. That wasn't human. The fog grew thicker, so thick that Jake had to slow down. His headlights barely cut through it now, and the trees on either side of the road seemed to close in like they were pressing against the truck. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the occasional pop and crackle of the radio. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, eyes wide, scanning for any sign of movement. Then came the knocking. It was faint at first, a soft tap on the side of the truck. Jake froze, listening. Another tap, this time louder, like someone was rapping their knuckles against the metal door. He swallowed hard, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The knocking continued, rhythmic, steady, like someone was trying to get in. Jake's mind raced. Was it her? Had she followed him? He pressed his foot harder on the gas, but the fog was too thick. He couldn't go any faster without risking a crash. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, and now it wasn't just on the door. It was coming from the roof, the sides, the back of the truck. It sounded like dozens of hands, slapping and scratching at the metal like they were trying to tear their way in. Jake's heart pounded in his ears. He couldn't see anything outside. The fog was too dense. But the knocking, it was everywhere, surrounding him. He gritted his teeth and kept driving, refusing to stop, refusing to let whatever was out there get to him. The radio crackled again. You didn't stop. Good. Jake's blood turned to ice. It was the same voice from earlier, clearer now, but still distorted, like it was coming from some distant place. His eyes darted to the radio, and for a moment he saw something, a shadow, a shape, moving in the fog just outside his window. And then it was gone. The knocking stopped. The fog began to lift slowly at first until the road ahead was clear again, the trees thinning out, the darkness retreating. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps as he drove out of Devil's Pass, his heart still racing. The road behind him was empty, nothing but the fading mist. He didn't stop until he reached the next town, hours later. He pulled into a truck stop, his hands trembling as he parked the rig. He sat there for a long time, staring at the dashboard, trying to make sense of what had happened, but there were no answers, only the silence. As Jake finally climbed out of the truck, his legs weak beneath him, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. On the side of the truck, smeared in streaks of mud and grime, were dozens of handprints. Small, childlike handprints pressed into the metal like they had been there for hours. Tom had been on the road for 30 years, and nothing much rattled him anymore. He'd seen the aftermath of gruesome accidents, weathered countless storms, and driven down roads so desolate you could feel the weight of the sky pressing down on you. But this night was different. He was hauling a load through the Appalachian Mountains, a winding route known for sharp curves and long stretches where you didn't see a soul for miles. His destination was a small town in West Virginia, but he wouldn't make it there that night. The first sign that something was wrong was the sound. It was faint at first, a low hum that didn't seem to be coming from the truck or the road. It was almost like music, but not any kind of music he recognized. It was eerie, dissonant, and as it grew louder, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that it was coming from the mountains themselves, like they were alive, humming some ancient tune. He glanced at the radio, but it was off. The GPS blinked steadily, showing he was on course. Shaking off the unease, he tried to focus on the road, though the sound continued to echo faintly in his ears. About an hour into the mountains, Tom noticed something strange up ahead. A light barely visible through the trees on the side of the road. It was too low and too dim to be a car. As he approached, he saw it more clearly, a flickering lantern hanging from a crooked post, just a few feet off the road. It swung gently, though there was no wind. Something about it seemed out of place, like it didn't belong there. There were no houses around, no signs of life, just dense forest stretching out in every direction. The lantern cast long, twisted shadows over the ground, and for a moment, Tom thought he saw something move in the darkness beyond the trees. He gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles going white. He wasn't the type to get spooked easily, but that lantern was setting off every alarm in his body. As he passed it, the strange humming sound grew louder, almost as if it was following him. Tom glanced in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing there by the lantern watching him, but the road was empty, just the dim light slowly fading into the distance. A few miles later, the road narrowed as it twisted up the mountainside and the fog began to roll in. Thick, suffocating fog, the kind that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Tom slowed down, squinting into the white haze, the beams of his headlights barely cutting through it. That's when he saw her. A woman standing in the middle of the road, her long white dress glowing faintly in the fog. She was barefoot, her hair hanging loose and wet around her face, though there hadn't been any rain. She stood perfectly still, her face turned down as if she was looking at something on the ground. Tom slammed on the brakes, his truck screeching to a halt just inches from her. His heart pounded in his chest. For a moment, neither of them moved. She didn't seem startled, didn't even acknowledge that he had almost hit her. He rolled down his window, leaning out to shout, "Hey, you okay? What the hell are you doing out here?" She didn't respond, didn't move. Something about her stillness unnerved him. Tom was a big guy, ex-military, not easily scared, but every instinct screamed at him to stay in the truck. Still, he couldn't just leave her standing there in the middle of nowhere. Against his better judgment, he grabbed a flashlight from the passenger seat, stepped out, and approached her cautiously. The fog seemed thicker around her, swirling in unnatural patterns. When he was just a few feet away, he called out again. "Miss, you need help?" She slowly raised her head, and Tom's stomach dropped. Her face, there was something wrong with it. Her skin was pale, too pale, almost translucent, like she wasn't entirely real. But it was her eyes that froze him in place. They were wide, unblinking, and clouded over, milky white like she was blind. She looked through him, not at him, as if she didn't even register he was there. Tom's hand tightened around the flashlight, and he took a step back. "Miss, I can call someone, get you some help." Before he could finish, she opened her mouth, and an inhuman wail erupted from her. It was a sound so high-pitched, so unnatural, it didn't even seem possible that it could come from a human throat. The wail pierced the air, cutting through the fog, echoing off the trees and mountains like it was coming from everywhere at once. Tom stumbled back, heart pounding, barely able to breathe. He turned and bolted for the truck, scrambling inside and slamming the door shut. His hands were shaking so badly it took him 2 tries to get the truck started. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the woman was gone, vanished into the fog as if she'd never been there. Tom floored the gas, his truck lurching forward, tires spinning on the damp pavement. As he drove, the fog clung to the truck, thick and unyielding, and that strange humming sound returned, louder than before, vibrating through the metal of the cab. It felt like the entire mountain was alive, watching him, waiting for him to make a wrong turn. He drove for what felt like hours, his eyes darting constantly to the mirrors, half expecting to see her again, standing in the road, her white eyes staring into his soul. But the road remained empty, the only company the endless fog and that eerie humming. Eventually, the fog began to lift, the road widening as he descended the mountain. Tom let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, loosening his grip on the wheel. He was almost out of Devil's Bend, almost safe. But just as he rounded the final curve, something caught his eye. There, off to the side of the road, was a lantern, flickering gently in the darkness, hanging from the same crooked post he'd seen earlier in the night. Only now, standing beneath it, was the woman in white. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at him, her blind eyes following the truck as it passed. Tom didn't stop. He couldn't. His mind raced as he sped down the mountain, the lantern's light fading in his mirrors. When he finally reached the outskirts of the nearest town, he pulled into a diner, his hands still shaking as he parked the rig. He stumbled inside, his nerves shot, desperate for coffee, for anything to bring him back to reality. The waitress gave him a strange look as she poured his cup. "You okay, hon? You look like you've seen a ghost." Tom stared at the coffee, then glanced out the window into the dark. Something like that. The waitress smiled, but there was something off about it, something too knowing. You were driving through Devil's Bend, weren't you? Tom looked up at her, his blood running cold. Yeah. Why? She set the coffee pot down and leaned in close, her voice low. You're not the first. That woman you saw, she's been standing on that road for over 50 years. My granddad used to be a trucker too, said she was in the same spot when he passed through. Tom's hands tightened around the mug. What is she? The waitress's eyes darkened. They say she's a spirit, lost in the fog, but once you see her, she never really leaves you. Tom didn't finish his coffee. He paid the bill and walked out into the night, feeling the weight of her words settling deep in his bones. As he climbed back into his truck, he glanced into the rearview mirror one last time. In the distance, barely visible in the shadows, was the faint glow of a lantern swaying in the wind.